Thank you, Tessie. When I ask, are you able to share the poll results? Oh, there it goes. It popped up. All right. So we've got 36% are in the 1 to 49 employee count, and then an even split. Wow, that is really evenly split. So that's incredible. Ted and Robert, are you able to see those results? Did they pop up for you as well?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, guys, let's get started. So I wanted to introduce you guys to our wonderful speakers today. We've got Ted Braxton II. He has 30 years of experience in the fundraising field. He has worked for about half a dozen national nonprofits in the course of his career. And Robert Simmons is the manager of DE&I at Share Our Strength and also a professor of educational leadership and policy at American University. Thank you both for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. Turnkey is a consulting firm. Turnkey is a consulting firm that's helped nonprofit organizations for over 20 years. And what we find is what we want to do in the industry is help form consistent, dependable, and a growing suite of revenue sources, looking at the multi-channel sources that are out there and allow the nonprofits to focus more of their time and energy on a well-funded expansion of the mission. We feel it's imperative to have this conversation today, specifically through the lens of a professional fundraiser. It's my personal opinion, there's been significant progress in the HR and mission sides of this industry, but I haven't heard a ton of conversations about equity and inclusion and what they look like to a professional, to a development professional. So we wanted to explore that out loud today with you. I'm Kate Bullard, I'm an account executive here at Turnkey, and I'm going to be setting Ted and Robert up, asking them questions that I've heard on the ground with my clients and other people that I know in the industry, so that we can speak to what some of the concerns, challenges, and fears are for fundraisers out there in the space. And we will try, just so you know, we will keep the organization size part of the context. All right, so Ted, can you please, we'll do Ted and then Robert first. Ted, can you share where you feel like we have been in the past, like where we were before, what's gotten us to today that's relevant to this peer-to-peer conversation we've got?
Sure, happy to weigh in here. I think for me, I kind of look at our recent history, and as a nonprofit professional, we have to take it in the context of our society. And so for me, I thought, gee, if you looked at 2009, when the United States swore in its first African-American president, kind of that was evidence that maybe we had shifted and become a little bit more of a colorblind society. But then I think we would all agree that maybe in the last 4 years, we might look at some of those assumptions as not being quite true. And so there are elements within our culture that have been in existence for more than 244 years. And so what's required to really see the change and get from where we were or where we thought we were to where we need to be is an intentional effort.
All right, and Robert, what do you think would be a good context for teeing up this conversation today? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think that for me, it's important to keep in mind that Dr. King said that essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, but that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. John Lewis mentioned getting into good trouble. Fannie Lou Hamer said, you know, nobody's free until we're all free, right? And so I think when you kind of put all of that together, you get the sense that, you know, it's a long road ahead, but it's also a long road if we look backwards from where we've come as a society. I also think that the ways in which the nonprofit sector works with communities in solidarity with communities is super important, in particular in communities of color. And I think that there's a legacy of both nonprofits and philanthropy working in communities of color, sometimes not well, but I think that there's a legacy that we can improve on and build on. But I do worry oftentimes that we're going backwards in some ways when I think about the attack on voting rights. When I think about some of the misplaced celebration, I could talk about it a little bit around the federal passage of Juneteenth as a federal holiday. As someone who celebrates Juneteenth, has always celebrated Juneteenth, just in terms of, similar to Ted's point around the idea that when President Obama was elected, there was this like, oh my God, we can move past race specifically. But the reality is that in America, we've never really confronted race.
All right. And then we've got where we are now. So how have events in the past year shaped discussions in the nonprofit space? So it's a very unique lens that we're working through together today. So any questions or comments, I really welcome them in the Q&A or in the chat section. Please feel free to put any comments and ask any questions. So to see change on the DE&I front, there are 3 things required. We've got courage, commitment, and executive level buy-in. So Ted and Robert, what do you guys think about what we would need to do for courage, commitment, and executive level buy-in to all play a role in this development piece?
I'll start here. I think for me, as I look at that, when you talk about courage, you have to look at usually your organizational structure and is there willingness to make the change on your board and at your executive level that you need to make. And then after you identify those changes, that commitment. How willing are you to follow the path that is in front of you? Because maybe your workforce is not ready, maybe your executive leadership is not ready, but when courage is required and action is required, you have to be intentional about the path forward. And it's really about doing the right thing for the right reason. And this is the right thing to do, and it is the right reason because our society is changing. And it really is about the future of your organization. If you're not willing to make the change, the opportunity to be relevant in the future is going to be diminished because our customer base, we are really in the nonprofit space, in the people business. And if you're not relevant to people, you will soon be out of business.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the challenge with where we are now is that I have found people to be, I don't want to say people, far too many people to be intellectually lazy when it comes to understanding where we are now, right? So in other words, there's this like great awakening as a result of what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right? In particular with George Floyd. But the reality of it is that George Floyd wasn't new. It's just that it was captured on a video camera on a phone by a 17-year-old young Black female, I think she was a high school student at the time, who just got acknowledged by the Pulitzer folks. And like, this isn't new, right? So I think that what you find is this kind of disconnect oftentimes, both in organizations and in the social sector, where people are just like, oh my God, I'm outraged, let's do something. But at the same time, you have Rosa Parks saying, even back when she was part of the Montgomery bus boycott, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Fannie Lou Hamer said the same thing, right? So for many communities of color, people of color, they're just tired, right? And so it can be problematic because the many nonprofits race to try to fix what's right in front of them right now without acknowledging the damage that may have been done in the past and try to remedy that at the same time, right? And so it's this complexity and nuance that I always talk about with folks that's super important. And I think that, obviously as someone who's an academic, I like to read and I love to write and I love to study the research and the data. But I just think that as a society, we aren't reading enough and having in-depth conversations to unpack all of the things that are happening in society and in communities so that we can understand the nuances of it. So.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I can share part of the generational things that we're seeing now. Like when I was growing up, with the explosion of the internet, like you could find information on anything.
Yeah.
And then in the last few years, now there's algorithms feeding the information.
Correct.
And it makes me think about, I have a anatomy physiology background, and we talk about two types of feedback loops that happen in the human body. There's a negative feedback loop and a positive feedback loop. And I can't help but think of it now when we have this concept of the news feed, where a negative feedback loop is the most common, where when you're running low on something, your body gives you more of it to help, like blood sugar. It's the way the body course corrects something running low. And a positive feedback loop is much more rare. And it's when you do something where you have something created, your body generates more of it. And I feel like the way we get news and everything now, with it being fed through an algorithm, I'm seeing more and more of anything that I find interest in. And I feel like that's limiting. It's going backwards for me. I'm exposed to fewer perspectives that way. And I don't know it unless I actively pursue, read more, search for more terms, like actively go outside of my algorithm to keep it, fresh and multi-channel. Yeah. So I think that's a part of it as well. It's just that how the internet is feeding us information. So
and it's a 240 character culture, Kate, right? Like, and I think that like we've become addicted to getting information fast as to going in depth with the information that we receive, right? And so, it's just super fascinating to me to watch it all kind of grow. And there's a great book that I would recommend. It's called #Activism. And this text talks about the ways in which hashtags and social media impact the justice conditions largely in communities of color, right? And they also look at things from an intersectional perspective. And that's the other challenge of this, is that people often operate nowadays, and even previously, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where they create this false binary where you're either Black or you're white, and they use a racial construct to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, when there are nuances. And to what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about is this idea of intersectionality, right? And without utilizing tools of intersectionality, you end up with this very narrow understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the nonprofit sector, which then means you also have a narrow understanding of the complexity and nuances of your mission, vision, and values.
Right. I love that. And I think that that's the balance that for this peer-to-peer professional conversation, that show me, you know me, emphasis that we're all placing to get to know our donors, to raise meaningful money and really steward those relationships. That show me, you know me expectation is fed by this algorithm culture, but we're also limited by it. So I think that's important to highlight that we're all facing today. So thank you for that. Any thoughts you want to add on that before we move forward with our poll?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. All right, so poll question number 2. Has your organization offered any unconscious bias or DE&I training in the last 12 to 24 months? Was it an organizational requirement across all levels? While we wait on everybody to fill in the poll, we do have a question in the Q&A. What do you do to share your feeling of discomfort in the workplace? We have a lot of people who think they're doing the right thing, but as a woman of color, I'm often offended by comments because their understanding of the right thing is misguided. Unfortunately, one of these people is my boss. Oh, that's heavy. Yes.
So one of the things, Kate, that I find interesting about this is that the usage of the term "the right thing" is subjective, right? And I think that, like, what does that mean, right? Like, when we say the right thing, does it mean that we're going to work on, I don't know, having a diverse board, diverse staff? Does it mean we're going to, like, what is that, like, unpacking that, right? And so, because people define what's right very differently, right? From a moral and an ethical perspective, right? And so for some people, you know, it's the right thing to do to not give people water and food when they're standing in line to vote, right? It's the right thing. So like there are these nuances to it. And I think in terms of what was mentioned in the Q&A, one of the elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are three parts that I always mention, right? Is this idea of centering justice and the justice conditions inside of an organization as experienced by those who are the most marginalized in society. Two, a sense of belonging. Like, how does your organization create a sense of belonging for those that may be marginalized, not just in the workplace, but also in society? And the third piece is this idea around power, right? And how is power distributed in the organization in a way that allows for those that you claim are part of this diversity metric that you may or may not have? Do they have access to decision making? Do they have access to budget? What is the approval process to spend all of the budget? So I think that there's that. And the last thing I'll say is that organizations need to do a better job, in particular when it comes to supporting Black women, right? And I just want to name that it's important because this past election, Black women saved our democracy. Like, period. They were the largest voting bloc in America, right? And so, like, it's important to keep in mind that, you know, like, Black women have stood in solidarity in the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was actually started by a Black woman. When we think about Black trans women and Latinx trans folks, they actually started the Pride Month, right? Like, they were leaders in this space. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, but at the same time, figuring out how do you hold space for folks and making sure that as an organization, when you go to your diversity numbers, don't just hire one, two people of color at a time. Like, you need to do cluster hiring, which is a common practice in higher education, where you hire them all kind of in the same timeline. You create a cohort and a professional learning community, and then making sure that everyone is assigned some sort of mentor and thought partner along the way.
Yeah. Ted, I'll get the perspective from your organization really quick, but Robert, if you had one piece of advice for somebody who has to talk to their boss and have that harder conversation, how would you give that? What advice in a short blurb could you do?
Speak your truth.
Okay. All right. Ted, what's your perspective on that?
I think with the current organization that I'm in and along the path that we've traveled, the intentional investment in really bringing awareness to microaggressions and activities that sometimes happen within the work environment where people are not really able to understand that their actions have been offensive, and having very specific examples and bringing someone in to facilitate those conversations that are often uncomfortable. You know, as Robert was talking, you know, one of the examples we talked about, you know, sometimes our sisters, our Black women, style their hair differently. And for someone to make a comment and or want to touch your hair is way out there. But again, it may seem from another perspective like they're just trying to be friendly. Well, that's not something that we do within our culture. So it's not really about just changing the elements in the environment. It's really going deep into cultural competency and creating a space where people are able to identify when they're still not comfort, and having the ability to change based on that, not the perspective. And as Robert mentioned, where does that power lie to be able to do that? One of the things that we recently had an opportunity to do that was very powerful was to have leaders within our organization go to the Peace and Justice Memorial in Alabama, and to study the history of lynching in America and the impact, and to be able to also see stories and connect that timeline to how our elements of our culture have been, and not knowing or looking at that history and translating it to the impact today. Like on that field trip, there was a member of our cohort who was in the gift shop. And so she was buying something in the gift shop, you know, and the salesperson said, "Oh, you need a receipt?" She said, "No," and she just threw it in her bag. And so I pulled her out to have a quick conversation and said, "You know, I was raised that I always get a bag. I always get a receipt because as a African-American male, someone would point out, did you steal that? Did you pay for that?" And so some of those influences that have happened change the perspective of that individual to understand my journey and path was different. But it's because our organization made the intentional effort of putting us in an environment, facilitating those uncomfortable conversations where people then had to step back and reflect on it. Even an exercise as simple as saying, "Okay, list out your 12 closest friends and how many of them don't look like you." So again, that helps to understand or paint the picture that there is still expansion that needs to happen as we look at this topic.
So we've got the poll results. Most of you, about half, have had the required training in the last 12 to 24 months. So out of that, if you can message in anything that you learned from those trainings that you think would be relevant to a peer-to-peer or development professional, please put that in the chat. Anything, any gaps you felt like the training didn't address for being a fundraiser, please put them in the chat. We're about to just enter a massive Q&A section. So put any thoughts, concerns, challenges into the Q&A or the chat. Before I go to the next slide, Ted and Robert, can you share what you think the role trainings and policy have today, and what, if anything, else would need to be included?
Interesting. I think trainings, it takes about, at least according to the research, it takes about 25 to 35, 40 hours to see a change in mindset and behavior when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it has to be this consistent engagement. And one of the missing elements, and this is from someone who spent most of my career in K-12 education, by the way, is this idea of having a learning agenda. Right. And like, what are the outcomes you want to have? And then how do you track those outcomes as an accountability instrument? Right. So if you send folks to an anti-bias training, but yet over the last 3 years, the only people that they've hired are white folks, but yet you have a target of increasing your racial diversity in your organization, then your training isn't necessarily working because their behavior and their habits aren't changing. Right. And so I think that there has to be this level of accountability where you're monitoring and tracking what are people actually learning and how are they putting it into practice. And then I think you build a policy to address either where the failings are or where you think there's room for improvement. Without a level of, without a level of accountability, a training is just like getting a book that you don't read and it just becomes a doorstopper, right? Like what is going to happen. And the last thing I'll say about this is it has to be ongoing professional growth and learning, right? It can't be viewed, and maybe it's semantics to some, it can't be viewed as professional development. It has to be viewed as professional growth because growth is ongoing, right? And so you have to have a series of engagements about particular topics. And there's an organization doing amazing work with this called the Committee for Children out in the Northwest. And they've actually taken 4 to 5 hours of time off of folks' plates so that they can dig into their equity journey as an organization. Wow. And it's had a significant impact as an organization. And so again, how you allocate time, how you allocate money, that's how you tell whether an organization is really committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, and for me, I think that Robert hit it on the head. It's the connection between the training and the accountability. You know, accountability is not just having the responsibility for the task, but the successful outcomes. So putting into place where you're actually looking at the metrics. on a quarterly basis, we look at what does that diversity and equity inclusion number look like by division, and that's part of your annual performance review. There's an expectation now that as you're looking to hire, that there's a certain target that your pool needs to include, and that's required for you to move forward. And so you won't have the change unless that piece of accountability really is about the successful outcome. And that's where leadership has to drive that vision. Leadership has to provide those metrics. And it's also goes down to that level, like Robert said, if you're taking a training, then how are you going back and looking at your people leaders and how their staff are interacting and feel that they're being treated? So you've got to measure those things, and it has to become part of the process.
That's right.
All right, so let's get into the meat of all of the questions for professional fundraiser. So let me start out with this high level question. Can you guys go into your thoughts on what the roles and responsibilities are for these three segments of audience? The leadership of an organization, the fundraiser, like the staff person in charge of a peer-to-peer property or grants, whatever that revenue generating property is, at the professional staff is number two. And then maybe even the role of fundraisers. What should we be encouraging, and what kind of culture should we be nurturing so that fundraisers can play a role here as well? So those are the three roles I'd like you guys to talk about high level. Robert, can you start?
Yeah, I'll start with fundraisers, just as I think that it's important to really think about the diversity of who donors are, because oftentimes the diversity of your donor base, the more diverse it is, it leads to other more nuanced ways of thinking about donor engagement, right? Because you then have different perspectives and different experiences, right? And so, again, I'm not talking about this kind of false binary of black and white when I think about diversity, but I'm also thinking about age, right? What we know in the research is that there's a new age of young donors and philanthropists that are doing work through family foundations, and they're like young, like, millennials and maybe even younger, and they may not be giving a large gift to an organization. However, having them and that relationship nurtured so that they're giving you money, but also access to their social media platform is also a form of development and fundraising, because typically those folks are much more adept at using, I don't know, Twitch, Snapchat, or whatever the other, I just use Twitter and LinkedIn. I don't know anything about these other ones. I've seen them.
You did good.
Yeah, so whatever they are, but I think there's that piece that is really important. And I also think that, you want to, if you're serving communities that have been historically marginalized, either because of race or economics or gender identity or whatever it is, you want to make sure that folks from that community are given the opportunity to learn about your work, to also support the community that they've given so much to already.
Right. Ted, what do you think about those three roles and how they interplay?
I think for the professional fundraiser and the development staff, it's really critical that you look at your audience, your desired audience, and your leadership positions within your volunteer efforts, and that it's reflective of the audience that you want to connect with, and they're empowered to give and contribute to the culture that you're trying to create. I think that also leads to your fundraisers being able to understand what the culture is of the organization, and it has to be reflective. I think it's also necessary to identify blind spots. So as a professional, what is that blind spot? What is that thing that I'm maybe not comfortable seeing, or I don't pay attention to, that impacts my ability to really connect with the audiences that I need to connect with? And being open to finding ways to getting that input and reacting on it. And I think that's really important along that professional continuum. Your fundraiser should know what your culture is because you talk about it. It's demonstrated. It's reflective in your volunteer committees in your work groups. I thought it was interesting. I had a trip that I took to work with staff in the market in the city on the West Coast. Very diverse community. And I'm looking at the volunteer committees and I'm like, I can see a whole bunch of people missing. And so our efforts are not going to be as successful because the diversity wasn't there in the volunteer leadership group. And then that is going to shortstop us in building that future for our organization. And the other thing is to think about is as the wealth transfers in our country to the younger generations, their friends, networks are more blended than possibly our professionals are comfortable with now. And in order to be relevant, that transition is going to have to happen.
Thank you. All right, I think now we've got some questions we need to catch up on. Let me look at them really quickly. All right, so I think what we should start with, Ted, would you be willing to share with us what you are doing for your event that you're helping to run, the efforts and stones that you're not leaving unturned with exploring this?
Sure.
Just your personal, what you're doing to make this happen.
So one of the things that I looked at is the events that we own and operate. And one of the opportunities was to increase the diversity. So again, I work on peer-to-peer events and fitness events. And so, you know, thought might be that when you're thinking about a marathon or you're thinking about a half marathon, you may not think about African Americans or minorities in that space. That's kind of short-sighted. So again, how do you begin to travel down that road? Well, one of the ways that you could possibly do that is identify affinity groups that already exist that reflect the audience that you want to connect with, and then intentionally make some inroads there. One of the other things to think about is if I'm looking at it only from the event lens, that's short-sighted, because I also have my workforce that I've identified that I want to diversify. So now can I not network within my affinity group to help socialize opportunities to become part of my organization and tap into their network to help get folks in that pipeline? And so you've got to have a really broad lens at how you look at the opportunities and who can help you bridge that road that you're trying to travel. And so that's something I've done that's very intentional, and then also look at it for a very diverse lens just outside of the fundraising. How do I build this relationship that may help me build more employees, et cetera?
So you are opening up conversations with different groups in the area that you're serving that have those demographics that you're looking for. You're welcoming their conversation and their voices into the conversation and offering them jobs, it sounds like. So,
correct.
So you're kind of helping to grow it all from each angle. Okay.
Correct. Because if you think about it, some of the affinity organizations that you could tap into, they've been in existence for hundreds of years. And so they are continuing to evolve and bringing new generations in. And so that helps us set ourselves up for the future.
Okay, so as event season comes, what's a good way to honor diversity?
Honoring, I mean, you know, I think that it depends on like what type of resources you have, one, and what is your level of commitment to the term honoring, right? Are you talking about an event? Are you talking about honoring through some sort of fellowship? But if we're just talking an event, it's really important to talk to the people closest to the challenge you're trying to solve, right? And so when I think about if I'm trying to understand the impacts of the disparate and disproportionate rates of incarceration on Black men and how to support their kids, I'm actually going to go, before I plan a fundraiser, I'm actually going to go talk to someone who is a father who has been incarcerated to understand the challenges, talk to maybe one of their children to understand the challenges. And that will help me frame the fundraiser and the event so that it's not done in this kind of spirit of help, but in the spirit of solidarity And then the last thing I'll say is that, it's super important to enter as a learner as much as you are a doer of the work, right? And I think that oftentimes some nonprofits and staff and nonprofits don't do that. They enter into the conversation as if they already have the answer. Some of this can be addressed in the setup and arrangement of the board, right? And if you're an organization that is addressing homelessness, but nobody on your board has ever been homeless or is currently challenged to find housing, what are we doing here, right? Like, how do you do that, right? And the last thing I'll say is pretty controversial in the fundraising world, but I'll say it anyway. It's like, you get this whole thing around give to get, right? The people who you may be aiming to support, they may not be able to give you a dime. But what is it that they're also able to give you that's of substance, right? And I think that this type of thing, I actually walked away from a board that asked, or before I even joined, told me that's what they wanted to do. It was a give to get board. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you work on homelessness issues, and like, you don't have anybody on the board who's homeless. Do you have anybody who's ever been homeless? No. So how do we, and none of the people even live in the community that we're serving. Like, what are we doing here, right? Like, this doesn't add up, right? So I think there has to be, and Edgar Villanueva, who used to be at SHOT, has talked about decolonizing philanthropy quite a bit, right? And I would say that it's also about decolonizing fundraising just a bit and how we think about it.
And do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think for me, what pops to mind, to the front of the mind in this part of the conversation, is authentic. You know, if you're honoring someone, it has to be authentic. So if I don't know you, if I don't know your journey, if I haven't walked in your steps, and I'm coming in with a preconceived notion about that, then it's not going to be authentic. And that, to me, is one of the major stumbling blocks with connecting with diverse audiences, not being authentic. So as Robert mentioned, coming in not with, I have the knowledge and I'm coming, but coming in with a listening ear to be able to find out how I can authentically honor you. And it might be, if we say, oh, we're coming up on the event season, how do I do this? You might not be in a place to do this. So it's better to have an authentic, powerful first step than a missed first step that now it takes you years to undo to try to get back to that place.
All right, thank you guys. Next question. I have a sponsor who I feel I would like to celebrate. Is it weird for me to ask them if that's okay?
No, I don't think it's weird. I think it's very important that you do that because, again, people have different thoughts around that. And it's always about what is right for you. I know some research I was reading recently talked about the difference between men and women in giving and the motivation and who wants certain kind of recognitions across gender or not. And so some of that plays into it. And so you definitely want to be conscious of asking the question and doing what's appropriate, because what may be appropriate for one person or one segment of your sponsors might not be the same for others.
All right, what would you recommend be the best way to bring up the subject of offering DEI training with my boss? I think that's asking the boss to have DEI training for the company. That's how I'm interpreting that question.
I think you always lead with data, quantitative and qualitative, right? Like you don't want to speak like Simmons' conjecture says X, Y, and Z, right? You want to leverage relevant data largely, and you want to use data sets, right? To prove trend. Like you want to have some trend data to say the sense of belonging from people of color is X. We want it to improve. It's at 20% satisfaction right now. The second part of that is both in the nonprofit and for-profit, and even in universities, I always say diversity is a business proposition too, right? Like there's a business case to this, right? And if you and I want to shout out my colleagues at Citi as one of the largest funders, if not the largest funder, Share Our Strength. But Citi actually has a diversity report. And Citi's CEO said in 2021, we're going to go big or go home. And if you're doing an interview, and shout out to my colleague, Jess Pointer, who's one of the most brilliant talent folks around, and my partner in prosperity, and all sorts of things. But she and I have talked about this in this Citi report, right? Is that this idea that, you know, if you want to increase diversity at Citi, they want to increase the percentage of people of color and women at Citi, domestically and internationally. The CEO said, as one of their metrics, 2 to 3 people of color or women need to be in your interview pool. Required. If you don't have that, you need to go back to the very beginning and start over. Then he says, your search committee and hiring panel should be the exact same thing. Then, as a result of this, you now have metrics to track. And then you can say, and again, shout out to my colleague, Jess Pointer at Share Our Strength, she's leading the charge in our organization to have anti-bias training in the interview process and the selection process, right? There are these two different parts of this puzzle, right? There's the selection process, like to figure out who gets interviewed, which is all sorts of bias that can happen. Then you have the actual interview that happens. There's bias in that, right? And I'm excited because it's actually going to be a requirement in our organization that if you want to participate and do interviews and you're the hiring manager, you need to get training on anti-bias work. And again, there's a metric that we have in the organization that's a growth metric as well, right? And so I saw a question in the chat about metrics, and this goes to this as well, is like, once you go to your manager with data and you propose the training, you also need to give measurable spaces for growth as opposed to like a benchmark, right? And the benchmark is always controversial. People will say, we want to hit 80% in a year. That may be true, but if you have a growth metric, you can track backwards from 80% to where people are starting to where you want them to go, because then you know what type of training to offer people and what type of support folks need. So I think making sure that you have data and metrics and doing some advanced analytics is super important as you go about doing this work. And I say this as someone who is both a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner, but also someone who is a trained researcher and academic, that the data, qualitative, I want to reinforce, qualitative and quantitative, because again, many nonprofits, because of capacity, not necessarily because they don't care, they often go with quantitative metrics because it's much faster to collect quantitative data as opposed to qualitative data. They tell you different things oftentimes, but it's super important to invest the capacity in doing great qualitative data collection and analysis.
So how would you balance that with the push on the technology side for this frictionless experience, right? We're taking our registration forms down to the bare bones to help convert, get people to register, and not be this giant survey form. How do you balance that need for data with people being inconvenienced by asking for their data? How do you bridge that gap that a fundraiser is going to experience? Because I'll tell you, not a lot of people that I talk to have any demographic data. They may have birthday.
I would say that they need to revisit that. We're not in the position where we don't look at that. And yes, you may want to have a seamless registration process. Then what other tools and resources, are you going to utilize to capture that data? Because those metrics need to exist, and you have to see where you're at. You have to see where you're going. And I agree with what Robert talked about in the selection process for employees. We're there. Your pool has to look like this, or you don't go forward. Your interview panel board has to look like this, or you don't go forward. That is the only thing that's going to get you where you're trying to go and need to go. It's a business decision. If you do some research and think about it, For-profit companies like Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Netflix, Goldman Sachs, Amazon, PayPal, Home Depot, all of these companies are investing millions of dollars on an annual basis in their DE&I programs. And so if for-profit companies are doing this, understand that it's a business decision and it's about the thriving and not just surviving of your business. And you've got to follow suit.
I have heard, one client that I was talking to, they said that because they didn't have data, the way they got the conversation started internally was they showed pictures of event day. They sat around a table and they looked at pictures of event day and they said, what is wrong with this picture? And I thought that was really meaningful, a good way to just illustrate the homogenous nature of that event. All right, so next question. What are your thoughts on creating and developing proactive programs with underwriting as a not-for-profit to increase participation in events by underrepresented communities?
Is underwriting, I'm assuming you're getting a corporate sponsor? I want to make sure that I fully understand what they're meaning.
That was not specified.
I would think that's where they're coming from. And from my perspective, just like I talked about some of the corporations that are making investments in their program, I wouldn't think of it as underwriting, but how do I partner with them in seeing how they're moving forward their initiative and how I can replicate that in my organization.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the underwriting piece is useful. I think the challenge is, though, making sure when you're a nonprofit in particular and you're doing a partnership that requires underwriting, that you're doing your due diligence so that there's any political fallout and like in the court of public opinion, you know in advance what you're getting into, right? And so I think that, it's just super important to think about as you do the underwriting, is doing your due diligence, which is difficult for smaller nonprofits because you need the money, right? You need the cash. And so the other strategy that I've seen work is partnering with other nonprofits to do this, so that it increases capacity for this type of event. And then you do some sort of revenue sharing agreement as well, that allows for the underwriting to happen of the event. And the last thing I'll say is that as an organization or nonprofit, it's important to make sure you understand what the underwriter wants to get out of it. Is it just name recognition? Does this exist in perpetuity? Like, you just need to have someone do the due diligence around what's being expected.
Right. Next question.
Hey, Kate. Yeah. There was a question about data and metrics. As you can tell, I love data and metrics because I'm a book nerd and a stat geek. I do want to say that it's important for organizations to make sure they're tracking a variety of metrics. And at Share Our Strength, in the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Roadmap, we have 5, 11, 20, oh, my math is wrong, 5, 11, 16, maybe 25 metrics. Some of them are qualitative, some of them are quantitative. And so I think that, it's super important to track something other than hiring, but you want to track things like what percentage of staff are participating in trainings. Are you giving out a pulse survey, which we use at Share Our Strength to track employee satisfaction? And are you using a net promoter score, right? Like what does that actually look like? I mean, net promoter is debatable by many, but it is actually useful to some, right? So I think that in terms of metrics, it's important to use the first year that you're doing your metrics, if you're going to use metrics other than kind of recruitment and hiring and all those things, but to use a year to establish the baseline of what you're looking at so everyone's on the same page. Because if everybody's not on the same page, then diversity, equity, and inclusion work usually dies.
Thank you. So we've got one more question. The diversity at our organization is pretty minimal, and I wonder, as a mid-level employee, how can I help to remedy this situation and advocate for change? The very select few people of color we had were let go during COVID.
Mm.
Mm.
That's a hard question. That's for Ted.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate that. I was just noodling on that. If you think about, coming out of COVID and think about nonprofits, we're definitely in a transition, right? We were in that same transition if you look back to 2008-9 from a financial perspective. And so where is your organization desiring to be a decade from now, 5 years from now? And how do you start that journey intentionally? Is there going to be an opportunity, just as we were talking about how you put together your review groups for interview process in terms of that next leader for the organization, and connecting it by data to the audience that represents your donors and fundraisers, and why those two need to be together as you create the future for your organization. And I think the other thing is that as a mid-level employee in an organization, all we could ever do is to raise the flag and talk about the potential impact of taking action or not. If we're not in that ultimate leadership role with the power to make that decision, ours is a voice that we need to raise. And having the courage to raise a voice multiple times, supported with data, supported with an enterprise view of our future is at stake. Because the research also shows that organizations with more diverse staff are better positioned to meet the needs of diverse customers and are more profitable. So again, even though we're nonprofits, we need to be focused on raising the money to drive our mission. Our mission will not happen without the money, and we need to diversify the audience of people that are supporting our mission.
I'll ask this question, which I have heard a lot. How do you balance the segments of audiences that are already giving you money, which tends to be more homogenous? Let's just say you've got a cycling event. It's not very diverse. How do you bring in a DE&I effort? Are we revamping the current property? Are we adding in a second property? Like, how do you make those decisions without causing the staff person to go, I am already completely like overwhelmed and have so much on my plate, I can't possibly do another event. So how do you balance that, those competing priorities sometimes?
And for me, I'll take that. I think that's where the path of connecting with the affinity group for my marathon event came to fruition. That was a way for me to strategically lay out a plan that could go 2 to 4 years of engaging that organization, developing that relationship, identifying within the scope of how we're working together, what created a win-win for them and for us, and how we promoted and cross-promoted each other and highlighted that. So again, cycling space may not be as diverse as we want it to be or think it could be, but there are still elements that can help drive us there. And you have to be intentional about finding that pathway and traveling it. And it needs to be, someone asked me this recently, making some radical changes to making sure our team raiser registration path for events is all in Spanish. And, the data didn't show that many people adopted that, okay? We didn't put an intentional effort behind promoting that it existed. So not only do I need to create it, then I have to invest in promoting it and look at it as a longer term investment to pay off.
Yeah. To Brian, honor Brian's chat, one thing that Robert said while we were preparing for this webinar just completely blew me away, which is you can't throw a 3 to 4 year strategic plan at a multi-generational problem. And so what we are all talking about now is an effort that needs to be intentionally followed for years and years and years. So the call to action here is not, as a fundraiser, go out and make your event the most diverse thing overnight, because if you do that and you rush it, you're probably not listening to all the voices that need to be in the room. So I don't want you guys to feel like this is a ton of pressure to overturn everything overnight, but but the conversation needs to be had, and we can't just say, oh, HR has got that handled. We'll hire, and everything is hunky dory. I'm going to be over here doing my walk. Like, no, I think we all have a role to play in this conversation. So thank you guys for being a part of this today. Does anybody have any other questions that you want to throw into the chat? These guys are very knowledgeable, but I know we had to, for the sake of time, make some generalized statements. So we got one more question. Are DEI efforts sustainable in a grassroots manner within an organization? For example, I work for a majority white male organization, and there's little to no effort nationally or regionally to invest in DEI. Is it worth it to spark this conversation in a small sphere of influence that we may have?
Yeah, I mean, it's always worth it, right? I just think that it's about who are your allies and your co-conspirators for justice that you're going to do it with, right? Like, I wouldn't recommend ever to do it by yourself. I think that there is power in organizing, right? And I think that's why there's strength when we think about movements, right? Whether we're talking about Me Too, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement, farm workers movement, any movement for justice, you got to go in solidarity with other people, right? And so in organizations, like, find a way to connect with other people who can be your partners in the work. And the last thing, just don't bite off more than you can chew, right? Like, do it one step at a time, because it's a journey, right? Like, and choose one or two things within the context of being in an organization like that makes the most sense. The less than progressive and radical revolutionary part of me says, choose the thing, if you're in that type of organization and starting at the beginning, choose a thing that's the safest so that you can get some quick wins early, right? And so I think that that's always a challenge for those who want to go fast. But as the African proverb says, if you go it alone, you may get there faster, but if you go together, you can get there farther.
All right, so really quickly, both of you guys, 3 key takeaways for fundraisers that you want people to walk away with today, very quickly.
3 things on my list: do some research. And Robert mentioned society doesn't read as much as it used to. Get into the research. The next thing is look at some of the others that are out there leading the charge, some of the corporations, learn from them, try to connect with them. And then finally, think about your workforce and your workforce of the future. The expectations of millennials, Gen Z, when they come to work for corporations is different. They're looking at you to see what kind of corporate citizen you are before they will be willing to extend themselves to your organization, their network, and their potential donors and supporters. So you've got to look at those 3 things.
Be courageous, do your work with conviction, and use charts to help get it done.
Use charts. I love that. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate everybody for coming today. Thank you guys. Really appreciate it. Bye.